Let's talk about K'Sante. At long last, League of Legends is releasing a new laning tank, bringing us the most mechanically complex pure tank we've seen to date. And if you have concerns that this is just a standard bruiser that Riot are pretending is a new tank, I have some very good news for you about K'Sante's playstyle and overall damage output. As usual, I got together with my community to test K'Sante with as many roles, builds, and playstyles as time allowed for, spending late nights refining my understanding of unspoken, generalized League concepts to make sure my conclusions could be as accurate as possible. Remember as always that it's impossible to have learned everything there is to know about K'Sante before he even releases, so please treat this video as a primer rather than a definitive guide. In this video, we will be covering the basics of K'Sante's kit, his skill order, the many combos he has access to, his purpose and playstyle, his responsibilities in a fight, his viability across multiple roles, his itemization, and his runes. K'Sante's passive causes his abilities to mark enemies hit for 4 seconds. Basic attacking a marked target consumes the mark to deal bonus damage, some flat damage, and some % max health damage. It's a very simple passive, but I cannot stress enough that it accounts for most of K'Sante's damage. You need to consume these marks. K'Sante's Q is a short-ranged, linear skill shot that damages and slows enemies' hit. The slow is for 80%, very strong, but very short in duration. Each successful Q, meaning each Q that strikes an enemy, grants a temporary charge. At 2 charges, his next Q is empowered, very similarly to Yasuo's or Yone's Q. K'Sante's Q3 fires a shockwave which pulls enemies towards him and stuns them for 1 second. The pull duration is fixed, so you can use it to force enemies away or to pull them over walls. Additionally, K'Sante's Q is an auto-attack reset. Comparisons to the Wind Brothers run deeper. K'Sante's Q is not affected by cooldown reduction and instead interacts with his stats. Resistance has reduced its cooldown, while HP reduces its cast time. Just be aware that until K'Sante's Q cooldown goes as low as it can go, missing one will make it impossible to maintain your charges long enough to generate a Q3. So don't miss. K'Sante's W is a defensive channel followed by a displacing dash. While channeling, K'Sante is unstoppable and gains damage reduction. On recast or after 1 second, K'Sante dashes forwards, dealing % max health damage, pulling enemies along his path, and stunning them. The dash is empowered with greater damage and stun duration based on the length of K'Sante's channel. The dash cannot pass through terrain. If W is cast, its dash can never be cancelled, even if K'Sante is silenced or grounded. However, if K'Sante is immobilized or grounded at all before casting W, he can't begin his channel. Needless to say, that's a major failure condition for this champion. Don't accidentally animation lock yourself out of a crucial W you need to survive. K'Sante's E is a short-ranged, untargeted dash that shields himself. If K'Sante targets an ally, the dash range is extended. And if the ally is a champion, K'Sante grants the shields to them as well. Yes, this does mean that K'Sante can dash to minions to extend his range, but he can't dash to wards. E cannot pass over terrain, unless K'Sante has targeted an ally. While the dash range is very short, you can still use it to evade key enemy abilities. K'Sante's R is a targeted knockback that causes him to blink behind his target, transforming into his all-out stance for 20 seconds. The knockback is very short-ranged with only moderate distance, but if the enemy collides with terrain, they are knocked back through the entire wall. When K'Sante teleports, he goes untargetable until arrival, deals physical damage, and micro-stuns his target. Both damage and stun duration are noticeably increased if the enemy passes through a wall. K'Sante's all-out stance is the more complicated part of the ability. On entering this stance, K'Sante's HP is reduced to 55% and he is not allowed to heal above this threshold. If K'Sante enters all-out while already under that threshold, he does not lose any HP. His base armor and MR are reduced by 65% of their respective bonus stats. In exchange, he gains AD and Omnivamp, he becomes Monolith, and his abilities change their properties. K'Sante's all-out Q no longer slows, but its cooldown is reduced by 1 second. The pull on Q3 still applies. K'Sante's all-out W no longer knocks back or stuns, but its damage reduction is increased, it deals increased damage, and it charges twice as fast. W's cooldown additionally resets when you go all-out, implying that you want to cast it first. K'Sante's all-out E has increased dash range and speed, and it can now travel over walls without the help of an ally. Lastly, K'Sante's all-out passive increases the damage of the mark and of its triggering auto-attack by a percentage, which scales off his bonus resistances. The mark damage, including the % max health damage, is converted to true damage. While K'Sante is all out, it's important to realize that he's not sabotaging his own ratios. There's a lot of effects in his kit that scale off max HP and bonus resistances, since he only loses his base resistances, not his bonus resistances, and since he's only prevented from accessing his entire health bar rather than actually losing max HP, his ratios still function as intended. Not to say that there's not any trade-offs to going all out. It can feel bad to lose access to your CC and to be easier to kill, which is why K'Sante can recast his ultimate at any time to instantly end all out. There's a lot that goes into how K'Sante uses his abilities, so it's fortunate that his skill order doesn't take the same brainpower. Max Q, then W, then E. Take E most of the time at level 2, though you'll discover some matchups in which having W is useful. The rationale is simple. K'Sante's Q is his core laning ability and he needs its damage. It must be maxed. Investing points into his E grants only 20 base shield and half a second off its cooldown. Not a great deal next to what W offers per rank, especially when K'Sante's shield value already scales very generously with his maximum HP. If you're playing support K'Sante, it's possible that you don't need all 5 ranks in Q. Still, I would advocate for investing 3 points before moving into W for its uptime. Now we need to explain how to cast and weave this champion's abilities. I'll preface this by saying that K'Sante is mechanically demanding and very context dependent. There is absolutely no chance that we've discovered every mechanic yet. The first major rule of K'Sante is that all other abilities should be prioritized above casting Q. K'Sante can cast Q or R during W or E. You'll find yourself relying on EQ very often during lane, and since you have the option to WQ, there is zero excuse for getting CC'd because you are locked into Q's cast time. I repeat, it is very easy to get caught up in the moment with your auto Q weaving, but you are a tank above all else, and you need to prioritize good W casts. All Out's knockback can be finicky thanks to its atrocious range, but you can't compensate by trying to R-flash. Unlike Lee Sin's kick, there is no chance to cast anything during the knockback startup, so you must instead flash R or WR. In a perfect world, you would be casting R only when you would suffer no HP loss and when your W is already down. The decision to cancel All Out is a judgment call. You need to recognize in the moment whether enhanced E range or resistances and access to more of your CC is more important for your immediate survival. An instant cancel does grant us access to a very neat displacement combo, WR cancel W. Use this if you just need somebody off a core carry by any means necessary. Q3 is not a fast or reliable form of CC, so to cast it reliably from beyond its own max range, you'll have to use 2 forms of mobility. The fastest combination of these mobility spells is E-Flash. E will not be cancelled if you flash immediately on startup, allowing you to dash from your new position. You can imagine that EQ3 works if the regular EQ does, but it sounds much funnier to chain all of our abilities together to kidnap someone. E-Flash Q3 W. If you want to fully maximize the damage of this combo, you can E-Flash Q3 Auto Attack, W Auto Attack, exploiting Q3's fixed pull duration to cheat out an extra hit. The no auto variant is very practical in real games for newer K'Sante players, but the damage variant is worth learning. For the absolute maximum displacement possible, add your ultimate to the end of the combo. Until W rank 3, you cannot cheat out an auto attack between W and R without breaking the CC chain if you also need to reposition slightly for an R angle. It's no surprise that K'Sante can Q3 flash in one fluid motion to re-aim his skill shot, but don't forget about the option to Q3 and then flash. This can be useful in very niche situations, such as when you're escaping from an enemy by peeling them off yourself. K'Sante has a few tap W combos, which are very efficient at generating good ultimates. If you need to quickly reposition for a better angle, or to close as much distance as possible without flash, you can choose to EWR. EWQ is a similar but more niche combo. I'd advise that you only cast EWQ3 if you choose to use this maneuver. Tap W is almost never necessary to cast while you're already all out. It charges so fast that it's never an inconvenience. It's also worth asking if WQ is worth it for raw damage. Wouldn't you rather proc an extra passive mark if it's most of K'Sante's damage? Well, as usual on this champion, the answer is a really unsatisfying "it depends." Sometimes you can use the damage, other times the instant Q utility is more important. Maybe you need your Q's cooldown cycling sooner so you can access a faster Q3. And here's one of the most absurd hidden mechanics in K'Sante's entire kit, the W flash. K'Sante is locked out of his flash during W's channel, but he's allowed to cast it freely during the dash. If K'Sante flashes directly onto an enemy, his dash is instantly cancelled, but the enemy is displaced immediately to the original endpoint of his dash. And yes, this is effectively an entire Gragas combo of CC in one moment. Your flash timing must be precise for optimal distance, and you probably won't find practical applications in every game, but it's clear how useful this can be. If you have no one to hand the enemy off to, it's probably better for you to flash W instead. K'Sante is a heavy disruptor whose many space control options give him extreme threat against dive or pick-oriented aggressors, amplified by the threat of isolating foes after transforming into a skirmisher. If an enemy enters K'Sante's effective range, they should almost always struggle to leave. K'Sante can keep enemies from escaping his teammates' threat, he can peel very effectively, he can eat critical CC with little consequence, he can skirmish really well with a partner, and in an emergency he can simply remove an enemy from play to start a 1v1. But he can't choose to get aggressive on a whim. K'Sante is a Warden, or in other words, a defensive tank. He's waiting to punish enemies. His most aggressive plays require either flash or an unusually strong flank angle, preferably both. And yes, his kit looks like a bruiser's, but his overall damage truly is not that high. I promise you that he's better suited to actually being a tank. K'Sante wants to be brawling alongside his teammates whenever possible. His ally cast E is such a valuable and powerful tool within a fight. So where does his ultimate fit into that playstyle? When is K'Sante allowed to just start killing things? One of the hardest aspects of K'Sante's learning curve is understanding just how conditional his ultimate is. Its tiny range, coupled with the fact that it's likely to isolate you from your teammates while stripping you of your CC, means it's super easy to get either yourself or a teammate killed by forcing the issue. Remember how we said we'd prefer to cast All Out when it causes no HP loss? That means we're often finding our windows after our tank responsibilities are complete. Other times we might want to ult early because we're out of peel tools and an enemy who absolutely under no circumstances is allowed to be on our backline finds themselves next to a wall. Sometimes the stars do align and we get to open with a good ultimate through a wall to threaten lethal. Sometimes we just find ourselves so deep that ulting back into our team is a great idea. My point is that there's a lot of possible ways to use K'Sante ultimate, but none of them are 100% up to you. You can't ult for the sake of ulting, and it can sometimes be correct for K'Sante to just not ult during a fight. If it is correct, it can sometimes also be correct to isolate an enemy, forfeit the 1v1, and just sprint back to your teammates with enhanced E range. The last thing K'Sante needs is another K'Sante piloting him. You need to be a tope. Temper his aggression, remember your responsibilities, and then you'll find more success on both the defensive and offensive fronts. In fairness to K'Sante though, he can absolutely be a 1v1 monster while going all out, which is valuable information for any lane phase or side lane scenarios. If super fed, side lane K'Sante in the mid game can be a problem, where he has the space to ult without being concerned about carrying himself into multiple champions. Side lane K'Sante also has the added benefit of being able to force 1v1s when multiple enemies come for him. His lane phase damage can be a bit underwhelming, but if he's allowed to get behind you and go all out towards his turret, you might be in danger. K'Sante players need to be aware that although the wall damage on his ultimate is valuable, it's fine to cast without the wall in small skirmishes, 1v1s, or late teamfights as long as you like the angle of your knockback, especially if that ult leaves you with a ton of space through which you can chase the enemy down. There's a few important things to know when playing against K'Sante. First, recognize how weak he is to poke or non-committal damage. This weakness is shared by most members of the Warden class. Second, his damage reduction and all-out damage can be reduced if he's hit by resistance reduction. Penetration doesn't affect this at all, but a good Black Cleaver, Nasus E, Rumble E, Kog'Maw Q, Olaf Q, Baron Nashor auto attack, or any similar effect can have a major impact on K'Sante. Third, this champion is crippled by any grounding effects. Singed, Cassiopeia, and Poppy create huge problems for K'Sante by locking him out of 3 of his 4 abilities, including the absolutely critical W. If you're standing on a Cassio W, you can't access your damage reduction. In top lane, K'Sante's matchups are similar to a standard tank matchup spread, but his unique kit does create some weird deviations. Carries that conventionally have good matchups into tanks can still threaten K'Sante early and dissuade him from trading proactively unless his wave is very stacked. However, he has more outplay tools than something like Ornn, and these tools enable some surprising reactive trades. Since K'Sante lacks reach, he'll really need to make the most of his kit to obtain early farm. He cannot avoid interaction, but he can flourish in that interaction if played well. In an easy lane, K'Sante would play for EQ auto attack poke as often as possible, but you'll find a lot of matchups in which you'll need to hold your E to dodge critical enemy abilities. The worst mistake you can make playing against K'Sante in lane is to walk forwards with a mark and allow him to auto-Q auto. This is his fastest non-committal damage, so K'Sante players should be looking to punish any enemy careless enough to let him regenerate his Q cooldown without trading back. K'Sante's reward for skillful defensive play is access to his ultimate and first component when the dynamic changes, because he's no longer just a tank. We may have made fun of that trailer in which K'Sante's turret does most of the heavy lifting, but that was actually foreshadowing how impossible this champion is to dive. K'Sante can turn fights from startling HP deficits if he gets a really good ultimate. Beware though, you have no damage if you miss too many Qs, and fishing for Ws at the wrong time loses you the lane on the spot. That cooldown is too valuable to waste. To overgeneralize our findings, K'Sante thrives against scaling tanks and can survive into most juggernauts or carries that would ordinarily threaten tanks, but folds to ranged champions, especially given his lack of reliable gank setup. Ranged opponents must misplay against your flash combos to die to your jungler. I mentioned K'Sante's support earlier. Is that viable? Does he have a place outside of top lane? To answer that, it's worth generalizing some tank econ concepts first. The viability of a tank outside of the top lane is ultimately determined by how much of their output is locked behind item and XP resources. If a tank has a major defensive steroid, they're lower econ. If their defensive steroid is ratio dependent, they're higher econ. Access to super reliable initiation often lowers econ. A reliance on sustained damage likely means higher econ, as does a stacking mechanic based on last hits. K'Sante is a champion with massive resistance and HP ratios throughout his entire kit, all of which directly amp his sustained damage and durability. That doesn't sound like a champion who enjoys having fewer resources. However, if a champion has unusually strong utility that compensates for the output they would lose for having fewer resources, then they could be a support anyway. Think of Tahm Kench, whose damage and presence skyrockets when you give him top lane resources, but whose ultimate is so valuable to ADCs that we can justify sacrificing that damage output by putting him in the support role. So, for K'Sante's support to be viable, he needs an ability with similar value. That ability is his W. K'Sante's support, like most Wardens, should be completely dysfunctional into any ranged matchup. His value must come from being played into engaged champions, defending his ADC with his high skirmish potential and peel. I'm sure his Leona and Amumu matchups are fine, but even in that context he'd struggle to deal with a long-ranged ADC behind them. Where he shines, though, is his anti-hook potential. K'Sante is in general the perfect brick wall to put in front of certain pick abilities. Blitz hook, Knot hook, Pike hook, arguably Ashe ult. I think K'Sante's support is real as a situational anti-pick champion. I would love it if we could generalize him into an anti-melee pick because I want to play him, but I don't find that super likely. Please do not blind pick K'Sante's support. Okay, but what about K'Sante jungle? Is that viable? Well, remember that junglers are only expected to have 2 items anymore, and you have to be an extreme power farmer. In my experience, that might be good enough for K'Sante. Well, we should hope so, because his clear is absolutely not fast enough to power farm. But this champion seriously struggles to gank without an egregious enemy mistake, and his invade, early duel potential, and clear speed are not strong enough to compensate for that. K'Sante jungle becomes an awkward, dedicated counter gank champion, a niche which doesn't sound appealing when other champions can do that and more. I don't think K'Sante jungle should see play. I've emphasized that K'Sante flourishes as anti-dive, anti-pick, and overall defensive utility. What this implies is that K'Sante is most likely to be a late development pick in coordinated drafts. Unless K'Sante players unlock some absurd combo potential through mastery, or discover a synergy pick that gets him into the fray more easily, we're probably going to want to wait for the enemy to commit to dive or pick before locking him in. His highest value team compositions are likely a defensive variant of front to back, a pure bait and punish, a hyper carry teamfight, or a siege comp as the defensive coverage. If you're a solo queue only player, you don't need to care about any of that. Just learn his matchup spread, or one trick him, you'll be fine. I have to generalize so much about K'Sante's itemization because he's one of those lovely champions releasing while a preseason is also on the PvE, which means suggesting super specific builds is a no-go because the state of items is unstable. We've had in-houses with Season 13 items and then the next abruptly uses Season 12 items again. Luckily, in K'Sante's case, it's still easy to extract the core concepts of how to build him. On screen now are all of K'Sante's ratios. These are some underwhelming AD ratios, but pure HP and resistances grant him a lot of durability and damage. It's also worth pointing out K'Sante's core damage loop of weaving Q and auto, so he obviously has Shane synergy. Before the resistance ratios got added to K'Sante's Q, you could have maybe justified opting into some extra damage, possibly by building Divine Sunderer. Now though, his core stats are so obviously effective HP stats, and every single bit of gameplay that I've seen implies that early damage doesn't unlock any new power. Now, if Yasuo and Yone rush Berserker's Greaves because of their Q properties, should K'Sante do the same with Plated Steel Caps or Mercury Treads? For the sake of a lower Q cooldown, no, he should not, but for the sake of matchups or all-out power, yes. All of the details of how Yasuo, Yone, and K'Sante had their Qs empowered by stats are on screen now. It's clear that K'Sante's takes much longer to come fully online, so don't make any first item deviations solely for this property. Since tanks should always prioritize a health component before a resistance component, excluding their boots, to optimize effective HP, it's not worth investing heavily enough into early resistances to make a difference in this cooldown. However, small amounts of boot resistances do make a difference in K'Sante's all-out AD, which when coupled with a resistance shard can be appealing. So to make this as simple as possible, whatever standard tank itemization ends up being in Season 13, I think K'Sante will follow with just a few variations. First of all, the Sheen synergy makes Iceborne Gauntlet the most obvious mythic option possible, even enabling a Touch of Death combo down a long lane against immobile opponents. This is such a powerful rush for K'Sante. The other variation is some potential Sterix gauge value second item. Super early damage is not appealing, but if we can exploit K'Sante's reasonable base AD while also gaining high HP and survivability while all out via lifeline, I think there's some potential. Now, standard tank itemization as a whole is leaning towards legendary rushes, with options like Anathemas and the buffed Randuin's Omen pivoting excellently into Radiant Virtue or Jak'Sho, the new tank mythics, unless you're an IBG or Heartsteel rusher. Does this mean we might see K'Sante deviating into legendary rushes against magical opponents when the lack of MR on IBG makes a difference? Does this also mean that into certain matchups it's optimal to completely skip Sheen and opt for a mythic that curves better following these legendary rushes? I can't answer these questions definitively given the chaotic state that the PBE is in right now, but I suspect the answer is yes. To reiterate, Iceborne Gauntlet is likely the most important variation on standard tank itemization for K'Sante, but given that we know for sure that K'Sante should value pure tank itemization heavily, we'll be able to follow the lead set by other champions on preseason's release. But this also means that we have to endure a patch of K'Sante without access to his core mythic on release, so what do we do about that? Frostfire Gauntlet feels so much weaker than IVG for K'Sante's trade patterns, and honestly, I would not fault you if you defaulted to Sunderer while waiting for better items. If you want to be faithful to what the champion is looking for in core stats, Frostfire is the best option, but its lack of damage weakens tank versus tank matchups. In those cases, consider Sunfire Aegis before it gets nerfed to Oblivion with the removal of its Flame Touch passive. Bommy's Rush into Anathemas or a similar legendary might be the way to go if you need to get onto the map or play for early power. Just try your best to make do while keeping in mind which stats are most important. I fear release K'Sante will have to spend more time scaling than he should require on paper. On the rune front, I have strongly preferred one specific page, this Resolve Precision Grasp page. Second and third tier Resolve are matchup dependent. First tier Resolve is dependent on some math. Shield Bash is usually not worth it, but K'Sante procs it so frequently and gains value from every property of it. If even that's not enough to make this rune good though, take Demolish. I have two precision runes for a very specific reason. K'Sante does suffer from some mana issues, so Presence of Mind mitigates those, while Last Stand is always active when all out and boosts its threat dramatically. Now for the Keystone, you may be asking why I lean away from Conqueror. I struggled with this decision since the closest comparison of a champion who can run both is a skirmisher like Fiora, and that doesn't translate excellently to K'Sante. Ultimately, since on tanks in particular, Grasp actually has long trade value that competes directly with Conqueror, and because K'Sante's ratios are so low, which reduces Conqueror's overall value, I universally went with Grasp over Conqueror. I may have overlooked some late game scaling value in Conqueror, but I'm still very confident in my choice of Grasp. But we can't always run Grasp, and we should entertain some alternate minor runes. In ranged matchups, we're not getting any expected Grasp value. I suspect in those situations that Phase Rush is ideal, since K'Sante's optimal punishes require him to get behind his opponent. If that doesn't end up finding value, we're left only with Unsealed Spellbook. As a support, we're obviously not taking Grasp, so the default would be Guardian. I find Guardian's current state to be weak, however. If we take Glacial, our Peel versus Engage matchups are much stronger, and this rune may contribute to some more generalized pick conditions than what I outlined earlier. For alternate minor runes, we could consider getting greedy with Cosmic Insight for more flash access given how many combos are enabled by that summoner spell, or we could spec into Sorcery for Monoflow Band, which relies less on continual interaction than Presence of Mind. I'm currently a fan of attack speed, a matchup-dependent resistance, and scaling HP as my shards. We don't need more damage via double resistances, and scaling HP always outperforms armor. Haste only affects W and E. I've experimented with it, I think it feels nice, but right now I favor attack speed for more comfortable farming and early short trades. So that's K'Sante, the pride of Nazuma. Expect to hear some very negative opinions about this guy on day one of release. K'Sante is a hyper-mechanical utility champion with very little room for error who incentivizes a selfless playstyle while also releasing without his core support from the itemization system. That's a recipe for the lowest release win rate we've seen all year. It will take time for us to develop our K'Sante skills and to establish his place in the meta, so please, if this champion looks interesting to you, commit the time to understanding him without succumbing to the doomsayers, and I find it likely that you'll be rewarded. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or a subscription, and please make sure to share any new knowledge you develop post-release to help the community out. I sincerely hope that the information within this video can do some small part in raising K'Sante's release win rate, and I hope that it helped you to prepare for when this champion finally goes all out onto the Rift.